Imagine a young king, crowned at the tender age of 13, fighting not just against a mighty army, but against a terrible disease consuming his body day by day. This is the extraordinary tale of Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, known throughout history as the Leper King. In a world where physical strength often meant the difference between life and death, how did such a young and sick ruler manage to defend his kingdom against Saladin, one of the greatest military commanders the world has ever known? Picture yourself in the 12th century. The Kingdom of Jerusalem stands as a Christian fortress amidst an expanding Islamic world. The Holy City, captured during the First Crusade, now faces its greatest challenge. Young Baldwin inherits not just a crown, but a kingdom surrounded by enemies eager to reclaim these sacred lands. From his childhood, he battles leprosy, a disease that would strike fear into the hearts of medieval people, marking its victims as outcasts. Yet despite his condition, Baldwin transforms into a brilliant strategist and becomes a symbol of unwavering resistance. His story defies all odds. While most rulers of his time were known for their physical prowess, Baldwin led his armies from the front despite his failing body. The mere sight of him, mounted on his war horse, wearing a silver mask to hide his affliction, would inspire his troops to fight with extraordinary courage. The medieval world was one of stark contrasts, where faith and power intertwined in ways we can barely imagine today. Jerusalem, the city of three faiths, stood at the crossroads of civilization. Baldwin's reign would mark one of the most critical periods in medieval history, as the young king faced off against the rising power of Saladin, who dreamed of uniting the Islamic world under one banner. If you love unraveling the mysteries of great empires and discovering the extraordinary tales of medieval times, like this video, subscribe to the Medieval Archives and join us on an incredible journey through history. Don't forget to ring that notification bell to ensure you never miss an episode of our Medieval Chronicles. This is the story of Baldwin IV, the Leper King of Jerusalem, a tale of courage, resilience, and leadership that would shape the destiny of the Holy Land. Let's dive into one of the most remarkable chapters in medieval history. In the year 1161, in the holy city of Jerusalem, a prince was born into a world of crusader kingdoms and ancient conflicts. Baldwin, son of King Amalric I, came into this world as the heir to one of the most prestigious Christian kingdoms of the medieval era, but fate had a cruel twist in store for the young prince. The first signs appeared during what should have been carefree childhood days. Young Baldwin was playing with his friends when his tutor, William of Tyre, noticed something deeply troubling. The boy couldn't feel pain in his right arm. Children would pinch him, but he showed no reaction. This seemingly small detail would lead to a devastating discovery that would change the course of history. William of Tyre, who would later become the kingdom's chancellor and Baldwin's chronicler, made a simple yet terrifying test. He repeatedly pricked the prince's arm with a needle. The young boy felt nothing. This numbness was one of the first signs of leprosy, a disease that struck fear into medieval hearts. In those days, lepers were considered unclean, forced to live in isolation, separated from society, and required to ring bells to warn others of their approach. But Baldwin was no ordinary leper. Despite this devastating diagnosis, his royal status meant he would receive a very different treatment. He continued his education as any prince would, learning the arts of warfare, studying military strategy, and mastering the complex politics of the Crusader kingdoms. His tutors were determined that his illness would not prevent him from becoming a capable ruler. Here's a fascinating detail that few people know. Despite his condition, Baldwin refused to hide away in his palace. He would later become famous for leading his armies into battle while wearing specially crafted gloves and a silver mask to conceal the visible signs of his disease. The mask became not just a way to hide his affliction, but a symbol of his indomitable spirit. The young prince threw himself into his studies with remarkable determination. Perhaps it was because he knew his time might be limited, or maybe it was his way of proving that his disease would not define him. He became particularly skilled in the art of military strategy, studying the tactics of great commanders who had come before him. He learned to read and write in multiple languages, mastered horsemanship, and developed a deep understanding of statecraft. This was a time when the Kingdom of Jerusalem was at its height of power, but also facing growing threats from its neighbors. Young Baldwin grew up hearing tales of battles and sieges, of victories and defeats, never knowing that he would soon be thrust into the center of these conflicts, testing everything he had learned in ways no one could have imagined. His story reminds us that true strength isn't always about physical power, but about the resilience of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming odds. As we'll see, Baldwin would go on to prove that a leader's greatest weapon isn't his sword arm, but his mind and his courage. In the summer of 1174, the Kingdom of Jerusalem witnessed an extraordinary coronation. A 13-year-old boy, already battling a devastating disease, was about to become king. Baldwin IV ascended to the throne in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the very place where Christians believed Jesus had been buried and resurrected. The crown placed upon his head that day would prove to be both a blessing and a burden. Imagine the scene. The young king, wearing ceremonial robes that concealed the marks of his illness, stood before the assembled nobles, knights, and clergy. The weight of the crown was nothing compared to the weight of responsibility now resting on his shoulders. Jerusalem, the holy city claimed by three great faiths, needed a strong defender. But could a teenager with leprosy really protect this precious kingdom? Beyond the walls of Jerusalem, a formidable opponent was watching and waiting. Saladin, the brilliant Sultan of Egypt and Syria, had been consolidating his power, uniting the Muslim world under his banner. He was known not just for his military prowess, but for his wisdom and chivalry. While Baldwin was learning to be a king, Saladin was already planning to reclaim Jerusalem for Islam. The young king's court was a nest of intrigue and competing ambitions. Some nobles saw his illness as a weakness they could exploit. Others doubted that a leprous boy could effectively lead armies or make crucial decisions. Baldwin had to prove them all wrong, and quickly. He surrounded himself with trusted advisors, including his former tutor, William of Tyre, who would later record the remarkable events of his reign. Here's something remarkable about those early days. Baldwin insisted on personally attending council meetings and military planning sessions, even when his illness caused him great pain. He studied maps, listened to reports from the frontiers, and began making decisions that showed wisdom beyond his years. He understood that while his body might be failing him, his mind remained sharp. The kingdom he inherited was like a delicate chess piece surrounded by powerful opponents. To the south lay Egypt, to the north Damascus, and to the east countless threats from across the desert. The Crusader states were a thin strip of Christian-held territory along the Mediterranean coast, constantly under pressure from all sides. Every decision Baldwin made could mean the difference between survival and disaster. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Baldwin's early reign was how he turned his perceived weakness into strength. His illness, which many thought would make him a puppet king, actually made him more determined to succeed. He couldn't afford to be seen as weak, so he worked twice as hard to master the arts of kingship and warfare. The stage was now set for an epic confrontation. On one side, a teenage king fighting against both a deadly disease and his doubters. On the other, one of the most capable military commanders of the medieval world, gathering his forces for what would become a legendary clash of arms and wills. The fate of Jerusalem, the city of kings and prophets, hung in the balance. November 1177. The air was thick with tension as word reached Jerusalem. Saladin was advancing with an army of 26,000 men. Baldwin, now 16 years old, had only a fraction of that force, barely 500 knights and a few thousand infantry. The odds seemed impossible, but what happened next would become the stuff of legend. Despite his condition, which had worsened over the years, Baldwin insisted on leading his army personally. Picture this extraordinary scene: a teenage king, his body ravaged by leprosy, donning his armor and mounting his horse. He wore a silver mask to hide his disfigured face, and special gloves covered his hands, but his presence alone inspired his men with courage they didn't know they possessed. The morning of the battle dawned cold and clear near the town of Montgisard. Saladin's massive army was caught completely off guard. They had assumed the Christians would remain behind Jerusalem's walls. Instead, Baldwin had force-marched his small army through the night, using his intimate knowledge of the terrain to gain a crucial advantage. What followed was one of the most remarkable battles in medieval history. Baldwin's knights, despite being outnumbered more than 5-1, charged directly into the heart of Saladin's army. The young king himself led the charge, his silver mask gleaming in the morning sun. The Muslim forces, unprepared for such boldness, began to waver. Here's a detail that few historians mention. Before the battle, Baldwin had the true cross, the most sacred relic in Jerusalem, carried before his army. His men believed they fought not just for their king, but for God himself. This combination of religious fervor and tactical surprise proved devastating. The battle turned into a rout. Saladin's army, despite its overwhelming numbers, broke and fled. The Sultan himself barely escaped capture, forced to flee on a racing camel across the desert. The victory was total. Baldwin's men captured Saladin's entire camp, along with precious supplies and treasures. This battle transformed Baldwin from a curiosity, the leprous boy king, into a legendary figure. Even his enemies had to admire his courage and tactical brilliance. Saladin, who would later become famous for his chivalry, spoke of Baldwin with respect, amazed that such a young and afflicted king could achieve such a victory. The most incredible part: Baldwin achieved this victory while suffering from a disease that would have confined most people to their deathbed. Through sheer force of will, he not only led his army, but outmaneuvered one of the greatest generals of the age. His victory at Montgisard bought the Kingdom of Jerusalem several precious years of peace, and proved that sometimes the most unlikely heroes can achieve the most extraordinary victories. Did you know that Baldwin's silver mask became a symbol of both his affliction and his indomitable spirit? The image of this masked king leading a cavalry charge against overwhelming odds has captured imaginations for centuries. If you're enjoying this incredible tale of courage against all odds, make sure to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the Medieval Archives for more amazing stories from history. What do you think about Baldwin's extraordinary courage? Let us know in the comments below. In the end, the Battle of Montgisard wasn't just a military victory. It was a triumph of the human spirit over seemingly impossible odds. A reminder that true leadership comes not from physical strength, but from the power of will and the strength of character. As the years passed, the disease that had haunted Baldwin since childhood began to take its merciless toll. The hero of Montgisard, who had once led cavalry charges against impossible odds, found himself fighting an even more difficult battle against his own body. By his early 20s, the leprosy had begun to claim his sight, and his limbs were increasingly failing him. Yet even as his physical strength waned, his mind remained as sharp as ever. Baldwin faced a new challenge: securing his kingdom's future while fending off the vultures who circled his throne. The royal court of Jerusalem became a dangerous maze of political intrigue, where ambitious nobles saw the king's declining health as an opportunity to grasp for power. Picture the scene in the palace: a young king, barely into his 20s, forced to navigate treacherous political waters while dealing with constant physical pain. Baldwin could no longer ride into battle as he once did, but he fought his battles in different ways now, through carefully chosen words, strategic appointments, and cunning political maneuvering. Among the most fascinating aspects of this period was Baldwin's relationship with his sister, Sibylla. Knowing that his condition would prevent him from having heirs, he groomed her as his successor. But this decision would prove complicated, as various noble factions tried to control her marriage prospects, each seeking to place their own candidate closer to the throne. The king's chambers became a place of whispered conspiracies and secret meetings. Some nobles argued that a leper king could not effectively rule, while others plotted to become regents, seeing an opportunity to rule through Baldwin's name. But they had underestimated the young king's political acumen. Despite his physical limitations, he maintained firm control over the kingdom's administration, showing that true authority comes from more than just physical presence. Meanwhile, Saladin had not forgotten his humiliation at Montgisard. He continued to probe the kingdom's defenses, waiting for signs of weakness. Baldwin, understanding that he could no longer lead armies in person, demonstrated remarkable wisdom in appointing capable military commanders while maintaining overall strategic control. Here's a detail that perfectly captures Baldwin's determination. Even when he could no longer walk, he had himself carried to council meetings on a litter. His body might have been failing, but his will to rule, to protect his kingdom, remained unbroken. He appointed regents carefully, always ensuring that no single person or faction gained too much power. The most poignant aspect of this period was how Baldwin handled his own mortality. He knew his time was limited, yet he worked tirelessly to prepare his kingdom for the future. He established a complex system of checks and balances, trying to ensure that the power struggles that would inevitably follow his death wouldn't tear the kingdom apart. As his condition worsened, Baldwin showed remarkable foresight in gradually transferring power while maintaining ultimate authority. He understood something that many healthy rulers never grasp. Sometimes the greatest strength lies not in holding on to power, but in knowing how to prepare for its transition. Even as his physical world grew darker and more limited, his political vision remained clear and focused on his kingdom's survival. This period of Baldwin's reign, though marked by physical decline, perhaps best demonstrates his true greatness. Not as a warrior king charging into battle, but as a skilled political strategist who fought to preserve his kingdom's future even as his own slipped away. In the spring of 1185, Jerusalem mourned. Baldwin IV, the Leper King, had finally succumbed to his lifelong battle with disease. He was just 24 years old. But in those brief years, he had accomplished what many considered impossible, defending his kingdom against overwhelming odds and becoming one of the most remarkable rulers in medieval history. His death marked the end of an era. The kingdom he had fought so hard to protect would survive him by only 2 years. In 1187, Saladin finally achieved his dream of recapturing Jerusalem. Yet in a twist of historical irony, it was Baldwin's resistance that had delayed this outcome for so long. The boy king, who wasn't expected to survive childhood, had kept one of history's greatest warriors at bay for nearly a decade. But Baldwin's true legacy isn't found in the eventual fate of Jerusalem. It lies in the example he set, in the way he transformed what others saw as weakness into unprecedented strength. Think about this. In an age when physical prowess was everything, when kings were expected to be warriors first and rulers second, a young man with a debilitating disease became one of the most effective leaders of his time. The chronicles tell us something fascinating about Baldwin's final years. Even as his body failed him completely, his mind remained sharp until the end. He continued to guide his kingdom, dictating letters and giving counsel from his sickbed. His last acts were focused not on himself, but on trying to secure his kingdom's future. Perhaps the most powerful testament to Baldwin's impact comes from his enemies. Saladin, who would go on to be celebrated as one of history's most chivalrous leaders, spoke of Baldwin with profound respect. He acknowledged that this young king, despite his illness, had been his most formidable opponent. In the Muslim chronicles, Baldwin is portrayed not as the Leper King, but as a worthy adversary whose courage commanded respect. The story of Baldwin IV challenges our assumptions about leadership and strength. In an era of brutal warfare and physical combat, he proved that true power comes from the mind and spirit. His legacy lived on in the stories told around campfires, in the chronicles written by historians, and in the lessons taught to future generations of leaders. Here's something remarkable. While many healthy kings of his time are forgotten to history, Baldwin's story continues to inspire people today. His tale reminds us that our greatest limitations often become our greatest strengths, that courage isn't about being fearless, but about facing our fears and continuing despite them. The silver mask he wore, which might have been a symbol of shame for another man, became instead an icon of defiance and determination. Even after Jerusalem fell, the memory of the Leper King, who had defended it so valiantly, lived on. Artists, writers, and storytellers across the centuries have returned to his story again and again, finding in it timeless lessons about courage, leadership, and the triumph of will over adversity. Baldwin never wrote memoirs or left personal accounts of his reign. But his actions speak across the centuries, telling us that true greatness isn't measured by the length of one's life or the strength of one's body, but by the impact one makes with the time given. In his brief 24 years, he showed the world that a perceived weakness could become the source of unprecedented strength. In the end, Baldwin IV's greatest victory wasn't on any battlefield. It was in showing that leadership comes in many forms, that courage wears many faces, and that sometimes the most inspiring victories are won not with swords, but with an unbreakable spirit. As we conclude our journey through the remarkable life of Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, we're left with a profound question: what truly defines a leader? In the story of the Leper King, we find an answer that transcends time and circumstance. Here was a young man who faced challenges we can scarcely imagine. A king who ruled from behind a silver mask, who led armies despite a body that betrayed him daily, who matched wits with one of history's greatest commanders while fighting a personal battle that would have broken most spirits. Yet in his brief 24 years of life, Baldwin showed us that true leadership isn't about physical strength or perfect health. It's about courage, wisdom, and an unwavering commitment to one's duty. Baldwin's reign reminds us that history's greatest leaders aren't always the ones who lived the longest or won the most battles. Sometimes they're the ones who stood firm against impossible odds, who inspired others through their determination, and who faced their own limitations with dignity and grace. Think about this. While many medieval kings are remembered for their conquests or their cruelty, Baldwin is remembered for his courage, his strategic brilliance, and his indomitable spirit. In an age when physical prowess was everything, he proved that the strength of character matters more than the strength of arm. His story continues to resonate today because it speaks to something fundamental in the human spirit: our capacity to rise above our limitations, to face our challenges with courage, and to lead by example, even in the darkest of times. If you've been moved by the extraordinary tale of Baldwin IV, the Leper King of Jerusalem, don't keep this story to yourself. Share it with others who might find inspiration in his remarkable journey. Hit that like button to help more people discover this incredible chapter of medieval history. Subscribe to the Medieval Archives and join our growing community of history enthusiasts. By clicking that notification bell, you'll ensure you never miss our upcoming episodes featuring more fascinating stories from the medieval world. From the courts of mighty emperors to the battlefields where history was made, we're here to bring the past to life. What aspects of Baldwin's leadership inspire you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And remember, sometimes the greatest victories aren't won on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when we choose to face our challenges with courage and dignity. Thank you for joining us on this historical journey. Until our next medieval adventure, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep finding inspiration in the extraordinary stories that history has to offer. This is the Medieval Archives, where the past comes alive.